Hello, thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here today. So I'd like to talk about wealth inequality in the US. And we all know that what's happening to income. We know that income inequality is high in the US. If you look at top income shares and you look at market income and the share of market income that goes to the top 1%, for instance, we know that it is high and it is growing. But the evidence for wealth is much more mixed. So the evidence for wealth comes both from surveys, the survey of consumer finances in the US, and traditionally from estate tax data, looking at the wealth of people who die and trying to infer how wealth is distributed among the living population. And these two data sources, estate tax data and surveys, they paint very different pictures. So there's a debate on whether wealth inequality is high in the US and whether it is growing. With Emmanuel Says, what we try to do is to bring new evidence by using another data source, which is income tax returns. So we take the income, the capital income that people report on their 1040s, on their tax forms, and out of that, we try to infer their wealth by capitalizing their income. And it's not a new method. It has been tried a couple of times in the past, but we try to do it systematically since 1913, the creation of the federal income tax, and using high-quality tax files. And then we try to compare, what we find in terms of wealth inequality in the US to other countries. So that's what I'll try to present. First of all, so these are the main orders of magnitude for wealth and its distribution in the US today. So 2012 is the last year that we have. Before describing the results, just quickly, what is wealth? Wealth, it's the total market value of all the assets that people own, financial and non-financial, net of their debts. Okay, and the total amount of wealth, you get that by looking at the household balance sheet of the US in the financial accounts of the Federal Reserve. And the name of the game is, okay, let's start from this macroeconomic aggregate, which is well defined, and let's try to allocate it to the different families in the US. So we define families as tax units, like in the tax code. You have 160 million tax units or families today, and their average wealth is $343,000. Okay, so that's the first line. And then let's look at the average wealth and the wealth shares of the different groups. And we find that for the top 10%, so for the 16 million families that have more than $660,000, the share of wealth that this group owns is 77.2%. Okay, and that's a very big number, and that explains why, I'm going to focus a lot, and people focus a lot in this area of research on top wealth shares. Wealth is always extremely concentrated, much more than income. So if you want to study changes in wealth inequality, it's critical to pay close attention to the top groups, and even the very top groups. Now, if you look at the top 1%, 1.6 million families, the share of wealth owned by the top 1%, it's 41.8%. Okay, so it's really critical to have good data on the top 1% if you want to say something about how US wealth is distributed. If you look at the top 0.1%, its share of wealth today is 22%. Okay, and for the very smallest group that we consider in this research, the top 0.01%, so 16,000 families with more than $111 million in net wealth, their share of total US wealth is 11.2%. So that's a graph here that just shows the time series, the time trend for the top 0.1%. So on the x-axis, you just have years since the creation of the federal income tax in 1913, which is the data source that we use. And on the y-axis, the share of wealth that the top 0.1% owns. And you have this spectacular U-shaped evolution. So 1 century ago, wealth was very concentrated in the US, so it peaked, the top 0.1% wealth share peaked at about 25% in 1928. And then you have a dramatic decline during the Great Depression in the 1940s, and then a remarkable period of remarkable stability from the late 1940s to the early 1970s. So really 2 decades where absolutely nothing happens. Okay, the top 0.1% wealth share is constant at 10%. Late 1970s are a bad period for the very wealthy. Stock market, crashes, inflation, and so on. So there's a decline in the 1970s, but since the late 1970s, you've had this spectacular and continuous increase in the top 0.1% wealth share, all the way back, or almost all the way back to the high levels of the Roaring '20s. So if we try to decompose the top 1%, to have a sense of whether this phenomenon of growing wealth concentration, is it something that involves lots of wealthy individuals, or is that very concentrated in particular segments of the wealth distribution? This graph tries to address this question. It decomposes the top 1% into 4 groups. So one group is the gray line, is people between the top 1 and the top 0.5%, so the bottom half of the top 1%. And the share of wealth owned by this group has remained remarkably constant since 1960. Okay, so that's not, this group of the population whose wealth is rising faster than the rest of the economy. Now, look at the next group, the next 0.4%, so the black curve, families between the top 0.5% and the top 0.1%. Same thing, there's no, marked evolution. The share of wealth owned by this group has remained quite constant over the last 50 years at about, 10-12%. So all the action actually takes place at the very, very top, the top, 0.1% that you can decompose into 2 groups, top 0.1 to top 0.01%, the blue curve, and the red curve, the smallest group that we consider, the top 0.01%, so families with about more than $100 million. This very small group of the population used to have about 2% of total US wealth in the late 1970s, and now it has about 12% of total US wealth. So that's a multiplication by a factor of about 6. Okay, what can we say about how the US compares to other economies? So it's a tough question, really. It's a tough question because for wealth, it's a bit different than for income. For income, we have great comparative studies and data and surveys which are harmonized in lists that you can use to compare income inequality across countries. You also have tax data. All countries, or most countries, have an income tax data, have had an income tax data for a very long time, so it makes it possible to actually compare market income inequality across countries. For wealth, it's much more complicated because no country, or very few countries, have wealth taxes. Okay, so we need to use indirect methods. So everything is more uncertain and a bit more speculative when you look at wealth, but I think that the main qualitative trends that this graph reveals are robust. So this graph makes a simple comparison. It compares Europe and the US in terms of their wealth inequality as measured by the top 10% wealth share and the top 1% wealth share. So Europe is just the average here of France, UK, and Sweden, the 3 countries for which we have relatively reliable long-run data on wealth concentration, as estimated not from wealth tax records in general, but from estate tax data. And so we are comparing Europe and the US, and the key result is that Europe used to be much more unequal in terms of wealth than the US in the 19th century and until the middle of the 20th century. And it was obvious to everybody that, you know, at least for white men, the US was the land of opportunity and was much more equal than aristocratic Europe. That's what, you know, Alexis de Tocqueville wrote about. That's what everybody felt strongly about. The US was much more equal than Europe. And then you had a spectacular reversal over the course of the 20th century, because right now, today, the US is much more unequal in terms of wealth than Europe. In the 19th century, most observers thought that inequality was way too high in Europe. And today there's been a shift in representations with many people, especially in the US, who believe that, you know, there's inequality may not be too high in the US, maybe it's too low, you know, in Europe, and many people in Europe who believe that inequality is too high in the US. So there's been a big reversal in both the levels of inequality and the representations of inequality. Thank you very much.